Christian Jochnik. I pronounce it well?
Yes.
We're going to talk about regenerative agriculture, rethinking ourselves and rebuilding infrastructure in order to support this transition. Christian, with Juntos y Pisa, you're bringing these two perspectives to life through a unique model of food, community, and farming. So we're going to talk about this. You have a farm in Ibiza, 70 hectares, and it's a regenerative farm. What does regenerative mean for a farm exactly, and what the goal? I know it's a big question to start, but I really want to understand what the goal of this and what is it.
I'll just give a simple example of, I've been supporting a reforestation project in Argentina, and we were thinking about how can we fund this reforestation project, and then one idea that came up was, maybe we can collect the herbs that grow under the trees that we are replanting and sell a tea. And then we can make money that can fund more reforestation efforts so that it could create a system that feeds itself. And then I said to Pablo, who's the one running the project, saying, but if we create demand for these herbs, are we going to deplete the herbs up there aren't we going to start to diminish the ecosystem instead of strengthening it? And then he said, well, if you work with the native population of that region, they know how to harvest these bushes and these shrubs in a way that next year it's going to be more, And this is what it's all about. If you harvest it in the wrong way, you're going to have less every year. If you harvest it in the right way, you're going to have more every year. And if you think about our society, everything we have, everything we consume has a value chain. That value chain always begins in nature. And the way we extract this value from nature is what matters. And what regenerative agriculture is all about is to figure out how can we, instead of having an extractive system, how can we have a system where we basically feed the ecosystem and then reap the benefits rather than going in there and harvest a diminishing source. So regenerative agriculture is a way to say, how can we create food systems where we are essentially feeding the ecosystems and receiving what we need.
So the goal is not only not to harm the planet, but to actually help the planet to regenerate.
Yeah, and I think it's the human being is not the base of the food system. If you have the insects, for example, it's the base of the food system. So you take away the insect population, then the whole ecosystem collapses. You take away the human beings, the ecosystem will be fine. The ecosystem doesn't need human beings, but we are a keystone species like the beaver, for example. So you put a beaver into an ecosystem, they will start to build dams, and they will start to collect water that will affect the vegetation. The vegetation will affect the type of animals that can live there. And then, the whole ecosystem will change thanks to the beaver. And the human beings is like this. So we can come into an ecosystem, and depending on how we relate to this ecosystem, we can either strengthen it or weaken it.
So how do you fight against the pests or the insects that are not good for the fruits and vegetables?
Basically, the ecosystem needs diversity to build strength. It's like our bodies is an organic system, and if we only eat the same thing every single day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, we will not get the nutrients that we need to feed our immune system. And it's the same thing with the ecosystem. The ecosystem, when you have a diverse flora and fauna, it builds up its own resilience. And it sounds a little bit like wishful, but it actually works. And when you reduce plantation down to one single element, so you only plant corn, you only plant wheat, you only plant oats, then it becomes very, very vulnerable. And it's quite incredible to see that nature regulates itself very well. It's typically when we start to try to control it and optimize it, we create a lot of problems that was not there. And there are people that can go into this in a much more technical level than I can do.
But you don't need like chemicals or in a regenerative or the minimum, or
yeah, I mean, it's sometimes you need to do treatments, and you try to source the solutions in nature. So, for example, you if you look at fertilizers, for example, you can make what's called in Spain we call it biofertilizantes. You make almost like a fermentation where you take soil from the forest, you put it into a process of fermentation, and then you cultivate bacteria and nutrients, and then you spray it, for example. And it serves the same purpose, but it comes from natural sources, and it has a lot more life and nutrients in it than what we would get. But the core point is that you don't really need to work in the same way, because you're not fighting nature as you do in traditional agriculture. You're actually nourishing nature, and when you start to cultivate in a regenerative way, the weeds don't become a problem in the same way. And it's hard to explain how. You almost need to see it. But the core principle, if we go back to it, is that when you work with regenerative agriculture, what you do is that you're feeding the soil. So instead of you're not planting to harvest, your main task is to develop the topsoil and develop the health of that topsoil. And when you start to invest into the topsoil, then you have a resource, and this resource can produce whatever you want to grow on top of it, and all the nutrients and the resilience exists in that soil.
Why is there such like resistance when we talk about regenerating the soil, like and a bit of skepticism in the air sometimes?
I think human beings are always resistant to change. We have a whole industry that has been built around the system that we have today. We have politicians that have created subsidies, support for these industries. You have big companies that invested in huge infrastructure to support this value chain. And then you have millions and millions of farmers that depend on this system. And to change this system is it's a big thing, and it's hard to convince people to change something that we are so intrinsic to our societies. And I think also we have to remember why this came about. It was we had multiple famines, we had 2 world wars, there was food security was a big issue, and when industrialization of agriculture happened, it was actually called the green wave. This is something that, especially the older generation, this was a massive liberation for them, and something that was very dear to that generation. So, and something that was a huge source of pride and accomplishment. And now, you have to declare failure and come to the realization that what we have been practicing for 70 years is actually extremely, extremely destructive for our ecosystems, and it's putting us on a path to a very, very uncertain path.
Do you think COVID changed the way or accelerated the way that people want to kind of come back to a more reasonable agriculture?
Yeah, I think, I think COVID, there was a moment there in March 2020 where I think the notion of system collapse became very real. There was a moment there where we didn't really know if the global supply chains was going to work, and that if I live on an island, so having ships arriving, I think in Ibiza, if we don't have ships arriving with food, we have about 48 hours of food supply. And I think this made the question of food very real. At least for us, it became, because we were developing the project relatively slowly, and we were focusing more on tree crops and perennials rather than vegetables, because this is a significant more amount of labor intensity to do vegetable production than to do kind of almond trees and artichokes and saffron, and but then in this moment, me and my farm manager were just looking at each other and saying, okay, we need to plant vegetables. We need to ramp up quickly here, because it was so uncertain. So I think this notion of how we are dependent on this very fragile global supply chain became very real. So that was on one hand. And on the other hand, I think it just gave us some time and space to sink in to ourselves and to our lives, and not be as distracted by moving around, socializing, traveling, working, and
fast life. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people also felt uncomfortable being in cities and social environments. So a lot of people started to go out to country houses and spend more time in nature. And I think this is the core of the regenerative movement, is when you start to understand the devastating consequences of industrialized agriculture on the natural world, from our water system to our insect population to our bird populations, and it's just devastating our ecosystems. And when you're back in nature and you remember that this is where we come from, and this is what we're part of, and this holds so much beauty and so much life, people start to ask questions and think.
What you say, you kind of answer to my next question, but let's see what you had to add. Which role will regenerative agriculture have in the future of humanity?
Well, I think regenerative agriculture, for me, it's just a mind-blowing revolution, in the sense that the agricultural system that we have today is an extractive system that depletes a resource. So every year we get less. We have less water in the ground, we have less insects, we have less birds, we have less butterflies, we have less flowers, we have less life, basically. So we are in a path towards less and less and less life, and one thing would be to stop this negative trend. But with regenerative agriculture, you can actually not just stop this trend, but reverse this trend. And I think what we are going to see is that, nature is extremely abundant. And I think everyone who starts to invest into nature realize that, if you talk about like financial terms, the returns of nature are quite extraordinary. And, you put one in, you get 10 back. And
that's what Camilla Fayed, we interviewed her for, I don't know if you know her.
Yes, of course.
Her.
Yeah.
She said, she mentioned this also, yeah.
No, it's really, truly incredible. And I think for me, I have 2 little children, and I'm looking into the future, and I'm kind of extrapolating what we have, and it's not a very hopeful vision. But I think we are really going to be blown away by how quick we can turn this trajectory around, and how much beauty and abundance that will come from it. So I think it's going to be I think it's going to be one of the greatest sources of hope and meaning and purpose for the coming decades. And I think we are also going to start to realize that when we are, in alignment with the natural world, so many of the things that we don't think are connected to nature depression, anxiety, cancer, ALS, many of these, degenerative diseases that we see are going to reverse. Also, bringing back economic activities, community to rural communities that have been left behind by urbanization, globalization, industrialization of agriculture has depleted many of these rural communities of jobs and economic activity and meaning and purpose. And I think when that starts coming back, we're going to start to see a much better balance in our societies as well, where there's today is, a huge polarization between rural communities and urban communities. So I think it's, maybe I'm projecting all my wishes onto this, but I really believe it deep in my heart. I think it can have a huge impact, transformational impact on the way our societies work.
Well, wonderful, Christian. So let's talk about what you do in Ibiza with your project. In what way can you tell us a bit about your project, about the farm and the food and everything?
Yeah, so I mean, we started working the land. We managed to buy a beautiful piece of land on Ibiza. And
so when was it?
5 years ago, and the intention really came from 3 different parts. One was this notion of being in service of nature, to really be a custodian of nature, so to take a piece of land and make it a beautiful place. And then the second was this notion, we were living in London, and I was living a very, almost like a perfect life, as everything I could dream about, living in London, the type of job and the place where we lived and all of this.
Yeah.
Very comfortable, beautiful, having access to natural environment. And then I felt, wow, this is so empty. Why do I feel so empty? And I realized that this transient community, this urban life where it's very hard to connect and meet, was a big, I really missed it. I saw this podcast that is about happiness, and they followed 800 people for 60 years, and there are 2,100 children to look at, like, what is really gives people happiness, and and these studies are typically like, happiness is a function of the following factors, and depending on X, Y, Z, it's either this, that, or the other, and it says something and it means nothing, and everyone is very happy and satisfied with the conclusion of the study. But this one was like really super clear. It was like, more than any other factor, happiness, more like, are you living in the city, living in the countryside, kids, no kids, working in this industry or that industry, being successful, all of that is secondary to the relationships that you keep in your life. And this became very clear. So from the beginning, I wanted this place to be a place where people meet and people come together. And then the third piece was to try to grow food in the most healthy way. And when you think about it, it's so obvious that you spray poison onto a plant that absorbs this poison. You eat this plant, your body absorbs this poison. I mean, it's quite obvious that this is not a healthy way of producing food. So the idea was to try to produce organic food, and the idea was to keep it relatively small scale and just create a space which is very beautiful, where you can connect with nature, try to use it to bring people together a few times a year for meaningful moments, and then try to grow food. And then from there, it's kind of evolved. And in the beginning, I had the ability to kind of let this project go without having to make money from it. But I realized that, having people working without earning their salary was not, it doesn't, it doesn't give dignity to someone that is performing a task. So I thought, actually, we should push ourselves to make sure that we at least break even on this.
Good, okay.
And then when you start to think about, margins, then you're like, wait a minute, actually this should be profitable, and we need to figure out how to make this profitable. And then
you want to be a healthy model for to reproduce, to be produced.
I think, and also I think the big realization was this, like, wow, this really works. We can really restore our ecosystems and feed ourselves, and we can measure it, and we can verify it. We can take soil samples, we can send it to a lab, we can get a lab report, we can see everything that is inside the soil, we can measure this, we can measure how much water we use in relation to how much we produce, we can measure how many insects we have, how many butterflies we have, we can measure the bird population, we can show that we are strengthening the ecosystem and feeding ourselves at the same time. And when I realized this, then I realized there's going to be nowhere to hide. All the big companies are going to have to comply with this, because it's inevitable.
Okay.
It's inevitable. And if you look at the regenerative movement, it's a movement, but it's not a public movement yet. Those who are interested in it and those who care about this topic, they are very well aware of it. But the big companies, Nestle, Unilever, Danone, they're already making bold commitments towards regenerative, and it's not because they're feeling pressure from customers or politicians. They're looking at the same data as we're looking at, and they realized this is going to be the future.
It's a win-win situation. Yeah.
Yeah. So then with this project, I said, okay, let's try to really make this work, because it has to work. and if it's gonna have to work, it's gonna have to make sense for farmers to transition. At the end of the day, farmers are really struggling today. Many of them operate in the most poorest region in our countries, the most aging population in our countries. They have diminishing returns, increasing prices for inputs. It's very difficult. Suicide rates amongst farmers, especially in Spain, is very, very high. It's a tough world, and you come there, you cannot just talk about, the soft values of saving the soil and saving the ecosystem and insect populations. You need to put a workable solution on the table. You need to be able to say, look, this is what you need to do, and this is what's going to be the cost of the transition, and this is what's going to be your OPEX, and this is how much you're going to make, and you're going to end up with the following return, and they need to believe in that in order to transition. So this kind of changed the project from a small lifestyle project to trying to be a little bit more ambitious. And
so what's the size of your project now? How many are you in your project, and what's the community you're working with? What's the size of it?
So I think the project now, we cultivate about 40 hectares of farmland, and we manage about 30 hectares of forest. We have, you can call it two different parts to it. We have our vegetable production, so we have 2 hectares of kind of permaculture, biodynamic vegetable production, and there we grow many different things, from beans and tomatoes to salads and herbs to root vegetables, and it's a system that is constantly revolving. So and that is very intensive. You need to be there every day working with it. And then we have an extensive system where we combine almond trees and then intercropping with grains, cereals, and legumes, and then rotational grazing with chicken and sheep and so on. So that's more something that you can do in bigger scale. And what we are doing, there's many people doing it. I think what's unique about our project is that we managed to acquire this abandoned dairy farm that used to have hundreds of cows. So there's about 25,000 square meters of cement in the ground, and then we have about 6,000 square meters of these farm pergolas, these sun shade covers for the cows. And what we are working on now is to close and climate control these facilities. And what we want to build there is kind of the shared resources for small-scale farmers, so the community of farmers on Ibiza. And I think this is one of the challenges, because if you look at it, the agricultural system that we are dependent on today is large scale focused. So it mimics the industrial revolution. It's like find the thing you're good at and then scale it, make it as big as possible, and optimize that process, which makes a lot of sense in industry. But in farming, what happens is that you reduce an ecosystem down to one element that is very hard to control, and the results is what we're seeing is that the soils become depleted. When the soils become depleted, they can't absorb water, so the water is not filtering down to our groundwater, and then you have to spray because there's not enough nutrients in the soil, so you need to spray with fertilizers and pesticides to manage the weeds. And then when the rain comes, it doesn't get absorbed by the soil, so it runs off, it runs down into our water systems. So we need to transition to these more small scale diversified farms. And if you say like small scale and diversified is a tricky combination, because it means you need to do many things in small scale.
It's a lot of work.
And it's not just a lot of work, it's also capex. You need to invest into tools and equipment, storage facility, processing facilities, and you need to have the knowledge, and then it's the work. And also, the way that the organic certifications work, for example, you need to wait 3 years before your farm becomes declared organic. So you take all the investments up front, and then nature also takes time. If you plant almond trees, it takes 3 to 4 to 5 years to receive your first harvest. So you take the investment up front, and then there's a delayed return, and also many projects cannot be considered organic until after 3 years. So it's very capex heavy. Everything comes up front, and you have the delayed returns, and it becomes very heavy. So you see a lot of these kind of small scale farming projects that start up with a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of energy, and then after 2, 3, 4 years, it's you're depleted. And what we want to do here is to invest into shared infrastructure, so that each project don't have to invest in this themselves, and then can and this is like contract manufacturing in the in industries, or like cloud computing for tech companies. Once before cloud computing, you had to buy the physical service, invest hundreds of thousands of euros, have specialized engineers that could write the tech stack to deliver your service. Now you go to Amazon and Microsoft and you say, hey, I want to deliver this type of service, and then they say, okay, you pay us 10,000 euros a month. If you need more, you scale up. You need less, you scale down. And it just enabled hundreds of thousands of startups to emerge that couldn't have done it before, because they had to raise so much money and make so much investment before they can validate that they have a business. So I think this is what we're trying to do with our project, is to build up a large-scale composting operation, seedling production, harvesting tools, processing facilities, transformation kitchens, farmers market. Really build these shared infrastructure so that it becomes more predictable and less costly to get up and running, and hopefully that can reduce the barriers for new projects to enter, reduce the barriers for existing projects to transition, and reduce the risk. So that's more on the supply side of the equation. And then it's really important that we now capture this opportunity to enhance the demand side of the equation, which is, many of these farm projects are in areas like Andalusia, Murcia, Almeria. This is the region that is the most affected by urbanization, globalization, industrial agriculture, climate change. This is where change really needs to happen, but they're so far away from the actual market. I have this project that I love. They've been, doing regenerative agriculture for 10 years. They've certified organic. They've been capturing data for 5 years. It's really the gold standard. They have this in Spain. They have this amazing essential oil, but by the time they come to it, it's one of the first like highly scalable products that they have, they end up selling it for conventional prices in the wholesale market, because it's so hard to kind of
margins were like ridiculous.
Yeah, margins are ridiculous, and they don't get rewarded. Basically, they go through all of these efforts, and then they get the same price as the people that are doing it in the conventional way, and this is really a big problem that farmers don't get rewarded.
You think this is a price the people don't accept, are not ready to pay for
I
organic?
think people are ready to pay. I think it's just a market failure at this point. I think there's a big part of the population today that are willing to pay for quality. I think that there's a disconnection between the people that produce and the people that consume. And I think this is a great opportunity for new brands to present themselves. And we also have a different distribution environment today. Bringing a food product to the market 10 years ago was a lot more difficult. You had to go through distributors and then retailers. They eat up, almost half of your margins just there. And now you can go direct to end consumers, and keep a lot more of those margins. Especially in the early years of a project, you can show that you have a market. You can start building a market and keep more of the margins till you have proven that you have a business, and then you can go in the more retail distribution. So I think now the markets are ready for these type of products, and I think consumers are ready to.
But don't you think there's a little problem of trust also? Sometimes people think like organic, there's this legend, or is it true or not? You will tell me. Like there's a label organic, but it's just a piece of it that's been made organically, and there's a problem of trust from the people about organic.
The problem is that people are lying, and people have been lying for years and years and years. Politicians are lying, companies are lying, news are lying, and people are fed up. People don't trust anymore, and this is the fundamental problem. And we see it so well, on Ibiza. We have these restaurants coming by, and it's like, oh, can we put a sign by your garden here, and then take a photo, and then say it's our garden, and then we put the tomatoes on the starter, and then we say we're farm to table, and it's like, no, you cannot, because it's not true. If you want to buy from us, please buy from us. And if you want to say that you bought it from us in your Instagram, please do it. But you cannot say that you're farm to table when you're not operating a farm. And, people have been doing this for so long, and people don't trust. And yes, certifications are a bulky tool, and there's 100 ways to get around it. And it actually drives, just look at, to get the organic certification, you need to make sure that your produce doesn't get in touch with conventional produce. So all the organic produce need to be wrapped in plastic. This is just so crazy.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think there are a lot of challenges to that, but I think data is the big game changer here. And now Scope 3 reporting data is becoming mandatory for big companies. So the data revolution is here, and now all the companies are under significant pressure to produce their supply chain data, their Scope 3 data, and they're going to have to go all the way back to the farm, the land that produces whatever that they transform and sell. And we are working, we're putting a lot of effort into understanding, like, how can we tell a story that is possible to validate. So you don't have to trust us. The data is there, it's available, it's on a blockchain. We have a camera that films our garden every single day. You can go in at any time of the day to see it.
Feeling.
Have
Okay.
Sensors that measure the water at any given time. This is where we need to get to, where it's not about trust anymore. It's about validation. You can go in and you can validate this data yourself. And this is where, what we are trying to do is to build a project where, compared to my friend on the mainland, Alfonso, with the Alfonso and Jochnik, they have this project called La Jonquera that do this amazing work with the essential oils, for example. For them it's very hard in the middle of Murcia to attract people. But in Ibiza, we have 4 million people coming every year, and they're all looking for something to do with their kids and their families. And so we're hoping that we can bring a lot of people through and to show our system, show how we work, and to start building trust. But ultimately, I don't want people to trust anyone. I want people to be able to validate themselves and to look at the data.
Do you think your Ibiza model of sharing what you're trying to put in place with the other farmers could be replicable in other? Is it the goal, like to replicate it in more generally in Spain, but in other countries?
Well, I think Ibiza is a very unique example because we when industrialization of agriculture took off, the tourism industry took off, and the land sizes were so small, so this kind of scalable model didn't really pay off. So the agricultural sector on Ibiza was reduced to almost nothing. So there's very little active farming on Ibiza today. So there's very little base infrastructure. So it's a very a thankful place to start because we can rebuild everything from scratch. I think in other regions they have access to these kind of supply chain resources in a different way than we do on Ibiza. And so I think if you ask farmers in France or in Spain and you say, do you have access to a processing facility for grain? They're going to say, yeah, of course we have access to it. And like, and do you have a distribution company for fresh produce? Yeah, of course. But then when you start to dig into it, you realize that, this thing is an hour and a half that direction, this thing is an hour and a half the other direction. And I think what I hope that we can show with our project is that when you bring the whole food system together in one site or in a very small local area, it's a bit like gravity. When two countries are next to each other, they're going to trade more than two countries that are far from each other. And I think, when you bring growers, you bring producers, people that make products, when you bring a local community in and everything is happening at the same place, and you have the education, you have co-working, you have community spaces, you will start to see an interaction between, farming, the people that work with land, people work with food products, people works with art and craft, coming together. You're going to start seeing synergies. You're going to bring a lot of energy to the community, and I think people underestimate how valuable it is to have these hubs. So of course, I hope that the hub that we are building is going to have a big impact on Ibiza. And I really hope that if we are successful, that will be replicable. And I believe it will, for sure.
Fantastic, Christian. So you're not like the typical farmer. You said like you you arrived from London, you were in the banking and consulting industry. You come from wealthy Swedish family. Mm-hmm. What led you onto this rural path?
From when I was young, after high school, I worked in an NGO for 5 years, which I have actually taken a lot of inspiration from for this project. And I was there for 5 years, and I was rebelling against my father and my background, and I was going to be a social entrepreneur, and I'm going to be out in the suburbs and help people. And then after 4 years, I was sitting there with the funding applications and the sponsorship relationships and all the kind of money stuff, and I was like, I was gonna be a rebel, not the accountant or the money person. And then I realized that this is probably my destiny, so I moved to London and studied finance and ended up working in the city doing investment banking. And then I went on an entrepreneurial journey, and then from that went into kind of venture capital, tech startups, and I had a moment where I was realizing like what am I doing? You know, I really don't like technology. I've always been very technology averse, and here I'm running around trying to do tech startups. Why? What? And at the same time, I became a father, and then I had my first kind of plant medicine experience, which really kind of opened things up for me, and really starting to go back to myself and really understand like who am I and what makes me happy and what makes me feel good.
Christian, I'm going to ask you the question I'm asking to all the guests here in Kaplankaya for the podcast. If something easy or simple could be done and would make the world a better place, what would it be for you?
So one thing that I think is huge is composting. Like when you start composting, something happens, you know, and once you started, you can never go back. Once you have clean waste and you realize like, wow, here my organic waste goes here, and the rest of the trash, it doesn't smell, doesn't stink, it's, you know, and then you put the organic waste into a compost and then you see it become soil. It's a huge thing. And whether you kind of plug in, you know, in many cities now, they actually do have organic waste collection and put it on a compost. Or if you have a garden, you can put a few chickens. Chickens are so easy to manage. You really don't need to work hard. You just create a nice space for them, and then,
okay,
you know, if you and then you can just put your organic waste for the chickens, and it's such a wonderful feeling, and it takes a lot of pressure off on our waste management systems, and I think it's a great first step. I think another one is just spend more time in nature, just like really being in nature, just smelling it, put your hands in it, you know. Oxytocin is the love hormone that drives childbirth, that makes us feel happy, that makes us feel loved. And when we hug and when we kiss, we release oxytocin. That's why we like pets, because when we interact with the pets, we release oxytocin. When you remember that the plants and trees are sentient beings, you know, soil is full of life. When you interact with that, you release oxytocin with yourself. So I really also just plant something or engage with nature as often as you can. This is also something that is very simple, but has a huge impact.
Thank you so much, Christian. It was really amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.